At 23 years old, Eliza Brooks had already lost everything. No family, no home, no place left to run. She thought the mysterious letter inviting her to an abandoned farm was just another dead end, until she opened an old shed hidden at the edge of the orchard. Inside were hundreds of forgotten letters, photographs no one was supposed to see, and a hidden family secret buried for over 50 years. But the deeper Eliza searched, the more terrifying the truth became, because someone had spent decades hiding what really happened to her family, and what she discovered inside that shed would change her life forever. At 23 years old, Eliza Brooks had already learned how quickly life could empty itself of people. First, her mother, then her father, then every place that was ever supposed to feel like home. After aging out of foster care, Eliza stopped unpacking her bags completely. There never seemed to be a reason to. Apartments came and went. Jobs disappeared overnight. Friendships faded the moment people realized how much sadness she carried behind her quiet smile. For the last 2 years, she'd been surviving more than living, working late shifts at roadside diners, sleeping in cheap motels when she could afford them, and when she couldn't, in the backseat of her aging blue sedan parked behind gas stations and grocery stores across western Pennsylvania. She kept almost nothing: a faded hoodie, a duffel bag full of clothes, and an old photograph of her mother standing beside an orchard she never recognized. Sometimes Eliza would stare at that picture for hours, wondering why her mother looked happier there than anywhere else she could remember. But the dead don't answer questions, and eventually you stop asking them. Then came the letter. It arrived on a gray Thursday afternoon while rain hammered against the windshield of her car outside a truck stop diner. At first, she almost threw it away. Most envelopes with official stamps meant overdue bills, denied applications, or reminders that she was falling behind in a world that never slowed down long enough for people like her. But this one was different. Inside was a formal notice from an attorney in a town called Blackwater Ridge. It stated that following the passing of Miriam Holloway, Eliza Brooks had been named the sole beneficiary of a property inheritance, an old farmhouse, 11 acres of orchard land, and one abandoned storage shed listed separately beneath the estate description. Eliza frowned. She had never heard the name Miriam Holloway before. No grandparents, no cousins, no family reunions, nothing. Just silence. But attached beneath the documents was a small handwritten note in delicate blue ink. If you truly wish to understand where you came from, open the shed. Eliza read the sentence 3 times. Something about it unsettled her. Not in a frightening way. In a familiar way, like hearing a voice you hadn't realized you missed. 3 days later, she found herself driving down winding back roads beneath a darkening summer sky, the tires crunching softly against gravel as endless rows of trees appeared through the fog. Then she saw it. The farmhouse stood alone near the orchard, old white paint peeling beneath years of rain and wind. The porch sagged slightly. Wild grass swallowed the fence posts. The entire place looked forgotten by time itself. Lonely, weathered, still standing anyway. Eliza stepped out of the car slowly, and that's when she noticed the shed. Small, faded red, waiting quietly at the edge of the orchard beneath the dying light. Something tightened in her chest, because for the first time in years, it felt like somewhere had been waiting for her to come home. The shed looked smaller up close. Not abandoned exactly, just forgotten. It sat at the very edge of the orchard, where the grass grew taller and the wind sounded different, somehow slower, heavier. Like the land itself was holding on to something it couldn't quite let go of. Eliza stood still for a moment, staring at it beneath the fading evening light. The red paint had almost completely peeled away. One side leaned slightly inward. Ivy crept along the walls like veins stretching across old skin. It should have looked ordinary, but it didn't. Something about it made the air feel thicker, like the moment before a storm breaks. She glanced down at the folded note still in her hand. If you truly wish to understand where you came from, open the shed. Her fingers tightened around the paper. For 23 years, nobody had ever given her answers about where she came from. Only fragments. Her mother refusing to talk about family. Old photographs with faces cropped out. A birth certificate with blank spaces where names should have been. Questions had followed Eliza her entire life like shadows. But now, standing there in the quiet orchard, those questions suddenly felt alive. The gravel crunched softly beneath her boots as she walked toward the shed. The closer she got, the colder the air seemed to become. Not freezing, just strange. The door was old wood, reinforced with rusted metal hinges. A heavy brass padlock hung at the center, weathered green with age. And attached to it was a key. Eliza stopped breathing for a second. The key hung from a faded blue ribbon tied carefully around the handle. Waiting for her, she looked around instinctively, half expecting someone to be standing nearby, watching. But the orchard remained still. Only the wind moved. Slowly, Eliza reached forward and touched the key. Cold. Her stomach tightened. "This is ridiculous," she whispered to herself, though the sound of her own voice barely settled her nerves. The lock resisted at first, then with one sharp twist. Click! The sound echoed through the orchard. Eliza froze. Something about that noise felt final, like a door opening somewhere far deeper than this old shed. She swallowed hard and pulled the padlock free. The hinges groaned softly as she pushed the door inward. A breath of cool dust-filled air rolled out immediately. Old wood, rain, soil, and something else beneath it. Something warm. Human. Golden evening light spilled through narrow gaps in the walls, cutting across floating dust particles that drifted lazily through the air. The shed was far cleaner than it should have been. Tools lined the walls in perfect rows. Gardening gloves folded neatly atop shelves. Glass jars stacked carefully in wooden crates. Nothing looked abandoned. It looked paused, like someone had stepped out only moments ago and never returned. Eliza stepped inside carefully, her heartbeat loud in the silence. Then she saw it. A large wooden trunk sat in the center of the room beneath a white linen cloth. Her breath caught. The trunk looked ancient, dark walnut wood, reinforced with black iron corners worn smooth with time. Unlike everything else in the shed, it had clearly been protected, preserved, waiting. The strange feeling in Eliza's chest tightened again. She approached slowly. The cloth trembled slightly as she pulled it away, releasing another cloud of dust into the golden light. There were initials carved faintly into the lid. Miriam Holloway, the woman who had left her this place. The woman Eliza had never met, or, at least, didn't remember meeting. A small brass latch sealed the trunk shut, and hanging from it, another key. This one smaller, older, delicate enough to belong to a jewelry box. Eliza stared at it for several seconds before finally reaching forward. Her hands shook this time. Not from fear, from something else. Hope. Dangerous, impossible hope. The lock opened easily. Too easily. As if it had been waiting all along. Eliza hesitated before lifting the lid. Then slowly, she opened it. Inside were photographs. Hundreds of them. Some black and white. Others faded with age. Polaroids curled softly at the corners. Every single one carefully organized into bundles tied with ribbon. Eliza knelt beside the trunk, her pulse quickening as she picked up the first photograph. A young woman stood smiling beneath the orchard trees. Dark hair, soft eyes, a familiar face. Eliza's breath caught instantly. It was her mother, younger than Eliza had ever known her. Happy, truly happy. And beside her stood an older woman with silver hair and gentle eyes. Miriam Holloway. Eliza stared at the photo, confusion crashing through her chest. How? Her voice barely came out. She flipped through more photographs desperately now. Birthday cakes, picnics beneath the orchard trees, Christmas mornings inside the farmhouse. And there again, her mother, laughing, living, belonging here. Tears burned suddenly behind Eliza's eyes. Because this wasn't possible. Her mother had spent her whole life acting like she came from nowhere, like there had never been family worth talking about. But these photographs told a completely different story. A hidden story, one no one had ever shared with her. Then Eliza noticed the letters beneath the photographs. Stacks of them, tied carefully with pale blue ribbon. And resting on top of the first bundle was a single envelope with her name written across the front in delicate handwriting. For Eliza, her hands trembled violently now as she picked it up. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Because suddenly, the silence she had lived with her entire life no longer felt empty. It felt intentional, like someone had hidden the truth from her. And deep down, Eliza already knew this shed contained far more than old letters. It contained the reason she had been abandoned, the reason her mother never spoke about the past, and maybe the reason Miriam Holloway had waited until now to bring her home. Eliza didn't open the envelope right away. She just stared at it. For Eliza, no one had written her name with that kind of care before. Not on birthday cards, not on Christmas presents, not even in the foster homes where adults mispronounced her last name and forgot her age 2 weeks after she arrived. But this looked personal, intentional, like the person writing it had known her. A chill crawled slowly up Eliza's arms. The shed suddenly felt quieter than before. Too quiet. Outside, the wind moved softly through the orchard trees, branches scraping faintly against one another like whispers passing between ghosts. Eliza swallowed hard and slid one trembling finger beneath the envelope flap. Inside was a folded letter written in faded blue ink. The handwriting was elegant but uneven in places, as though age or illness had made the writer's hands shake. She unfolded it carefully and began to read. My dear Eliza, if you are reading this, then it means I no longer had enough time to explain everything myself. I prayed I would. God knows I tried. But some truths spend so many years buried that people begin believing silence is safer than honesty. Your mother believed that too. Eliza stopped breathing. Her eyes moved faster now. You were never abandoned because you were unwanted. You were hidden because your mother thought it was the only way to protect you. A sharp pressure tightened in Eliza's chest. She sat down hard against the wooden floorboards. The words blurred for a moment through sudden tears. Hidden. Protected from what? Her pulse hammered louder with every line. There are things about this family the town never knew. Things they would not have understood back then. Maybe they still won't. But you deserve the truth. Eliza wiped quickly at her eyes and kept reading. And slowly, the story began unfolding. Her mother's name had been Claire Holloway. Not Brooks. Holloway. Miriam's daughter. Eliza's hands began shaking again. Her mother had changed her last name before Eliza was born. Erased it completely. The letter explained how Claire grew up on this farm, surrounded by secrets no one spoke aloud. Stories hidden beneath politeness, love disguised as friendship, grief buried beneath routine. And at the center of all of it was a man named Samuel Reed. Eliza frowned. The name meant nothing to her. Until she read the next sentence. Samuel was the love of your mother's life. Eliza blinked rapidly. She'd never heard that name before. Not once. Her mother never talked about relationships, never kept photographs, never mentioned Eliza's father except to say, "He's gone." That was it. Gone. But now the truth sat trembling in her hands. Samuel Reed wasn't gone when Claire became pregnant. He disappeared afterward. The letter described the summer Claire fell in love with him, a quiet young artist who came to Blackwater Ridge to restore the church murals outside town. Miriam wrote about how Samuel painted flowers across old ceilings, while Claire followed him through the orchard like sunlight itself. They planned to leave together, start over somewhere bigger, kinder. But people in town began talking, because Samuel wasn't alone when he arrived. He came with another man, a man named Daniel Mercer. And according to the whispers spreading through Blackwater Ridge, Samuel loved him too. Eliza's breath caught. The room suddenly tilted slightly beneath her. The letter continued. People can survive poverty. They can survive grief. But sometimes they cannot survive being seen differently in a place that fears difference. The townspeople turned cruel quickly. Church sermons changed. Neighbors stopped waving. Rumors spread through grocery stores and diner booths. Then one night, Samuel vanished. No goodbye, no explanation, nothing. Claire spent months searching for him. By the time Eliza was born, she had become someone else entirely quieter, frightened, hollowed out by shame and heartbreak. And eventually, she ran too, changed her name, cut ties with Miriam, tried to bury Blackwater Ridge forever. Eliza lowered the letter slowly into her lap. Her mind spun violently. This couldn't be real. Her entire life had been built on silence. And now every silence suddenly had meaning. Every unanswered question, every look her mother avoided, every night she cried alone thinking no one heard. It all traced back here. To this orchard, this shed, this family. Tears rolled silently down Eliza's face now. Not loud, not dramatic, just years of loneliness finally cracking open. Because for the first time in her life, she understood something devastating. Her mother hadn't been ashamed of her. She had been running from pain. A soft sound suddenly broke the silence. Creak. Eliza froze instantly. The sound came from somewhere behind her. Slowly, she turned. At first, she saw nothing except shelves and shadows stretching across the walls. Then, movement. Her heart nearly stopped. A hidden door stood partially open near the back corner of the shed, concealed behind old hanging canvas tarps. Eliza stared at it in shock. She would have sworn it wasn't there before. The narrow wooden door blended almost perfectly into the wall itself. A cold rush moved through her stomach, because faint light glowed beneath it. Warm yellow light. Impossible light. Her pulse thundered. Someone was down there. Or had been. Eliza? The voice was barely audible. Soft. Weak. But unmistakably real. Eliza shot to her feet so fast the letters scattered across the floor. Her breathing turned shallow instantly. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But the voice came again. Eliza, please. Her blood went cold. Because somehow, the voice sounded familiar. Not familiar from memory. Familiar from dreams. From childhood moments half forgotten. Like hearing a lullaby your body remembers before your mind does. Eliza stepped slowly toward the hidden door. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, and with every step, the air grew warmer. The light beneath the doorway flickered softly now, like candlelight. Her hand trembled violently as she reached for the handle, and somewhere deep inside herself, beneath the fear, beneath the confusion, beneath 23 years of abandonment, Eliza felt something else rising. Hope. Terrifying hope. Because suddenly, she no longer believed she came to Blackwater Ridge only to uncover a secret. She was beginning to fear. Someone had been waiting for her all along. Eliza stood frozen in front of the hidden door, her hand hovering inches from the handle. The voice had stopped, but the silence felt alive now. The warm glow beneath the door flickered softly against the floorboards, and for one impossible moment, Eliza wondered if exhaustion had finally broken something inside her mind. Maybe grief could do that. Maybe loneliness could too. Because hidden doors and whispering voices didn't belong in real life. And yet, here she was. Her breathing shook as she slowly wrapped trembling fingers around the handle. The metal felt warm. Not dusty, not cold from years of neglect. Warm. Like someone had touched it recently. Eliza swallowed hard and pulled the door open. A narrow staircase revealed itself immediately, descending beneath the shed into darkness lit only by scattered candlelight below. Her heart pounded violently. The air drifting upward smelled faintly of cedarwood, old paper, and something sweeter underneath. Lavender. A scent she recognized instantly. Her mother used to wear lavender oil when Eliza was little. The memory hit her so suddenly it nearly hurt. For years, she'd struggled to remember small things about her mother clearly. Trauma had a way of blurring childhood into disconnected pieces. But now memories began surfacing all at once. Her mother humming softly beside a motel sink. Hands braiding Eliza's hair before school. A whisper against her forehead, "You are loved more than you know." Tears burned her eyes again. Slowly, Eliza descended the stairs. Each wooden step creaked beneath her weight until finally she reached the bottom and stopped. The underground room looked nothing like she expected. It wasn't frightening. It was beautiful. Small lanterns cast warm, golden light across stone walls lined with bookshelves. Blankets covered a worn leather sofa near the corner. Paintings leaned carefully against the walls, unfinished portraits. Orchards in springtime. Faces sketched lovingly in charcoal and ink. It looked less like a hiding place, and more like somewhere people came to breathe honestly, to exist safely. A small record player sat atop a wooden table beside stacks of journals tied carefully with ribbon, and directly across the room hung a portrait of her mother. Eliza's breath caught painfully. Claire Holloway looked no older than 20 in the painting. Her dark hair curled loosely around her shoulders as she smiled toward someone outside the frame. Toward the artist. Toward Samuel. The expression on her face shattered something inside Eliza, because she had never seen her mother look that free before. Not once. Not in real life. Not in any memory. She loved this room. The voice came quietly from the shadows behind her. Eliza spun around instantly. An older man stood near the far wall holding a lantern in trembling hands. Thin, gray-haired, late 70s, maybe older. His eyes widened slightly the moment they landed on her. And suddenly, Eliza understood why the voice had sounded familiar. He had her mother's eyes. Soft, sad, kind in a wounded sort of way. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then the man smiled faintly through tears, already gathering in his eyes. "You look just like her," he whispered. Eliza's chest tightened painfully. "Who are you?" The man swallowed hard before answering. "My name is Daniel Mercer." The name hit her instantly. Samuel's companion. The man the town whispered about. The man connected to everything. Eliza stared at him, unable to move. "You knew my mother." Daniel let out a small broken laugh. "Knew her?" His voice cracked softly. "Eliza. I helped raise her." The room tilted slightly beneath her feet. "No," she whispered immediately. "That's not possible." But Daniel only nodded slowly. "Your mother grew up here, in this room, in this orchard." He looked around quietly. This place was the only part of town where people could be themselves without fear. Eliza's pulse thundered louder. "Where's Samuel?" At that, silence fell heavily across the room. Daniel lowered his eyes, and Eliza knew before he even spoke. "He died a long time ago." The words landed softly, but they hurt anyway. Daniel sat carefully in a nearby chair. Exhaustion visible in every movement now. "He got sick during the winter of 1989, he said quietly. "Back then, people didn't understand, or maybe they refused to." His jaw tightened painfully. The town treated him like something shameful. Eliza's stomach twisted. Daniel continued slowly. "Your mother stayed beside him every day, so did Miriam. We all did." He smiled sadly. "Samuel used to say this room saved his life long before it became the place he died." Eliza looked around again. Suddenly, she saw everything differently. The paintings, the books, the letters upstairs, the careful preservation of every memory. This wasn't just hidden history. It was survival, a sanctuary built by people the world forced into silence. And for the first time in her life, Eliza realized silence could be inherited too. Her mother hadn't simply run away. She carried generations of fear inside her. Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear that love itself could destroy lives. Daniel reached into his jacket slowly and pulled out a small photograph. He handed it carefully to Eliza. It showed Samuel standing beside Claire beneath the orchard trees. And between them, a little girl no older than 3, Eliza. Her breath stopped completely. On the back, written in faded ink, were 4 words. "Our reason to stay." A sob escaped her before she could stop it, because suddenly she understood everything. Her mother hadn't spent her life hiding because she was weak. She hid because she was trying to protect the only thing she loved more than herself. Her daughter. Daniel watched her quietly for a long moment before speaking again. "Miriam wanted to tell you the truth years ago," he said softly. "But your mother begged her not to." "Why?" Daniel's eyes filled instantly. "Because Claire believed this family ruined everyone it touched." Eliza shook her head through tears. "That's not true." "No," Daniel whispered. "It isn't." The room fell silent again except for the faint crackling of candlelight. Then Daniel looked at her carefully. "But you being here changes things." Eliza frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Daniel glanced toward the shelves lined with journals and photographs. "For decades, this family buried its truth to survive." He paused. "But maybe survival isn't the same thing as living." Eliza looked slowly around the hidden room once more. At the art, the stories, the love preserved underground because the world above never made room for it. And something inside her shifted. For 23 years, she believed she came from nothing. No roots, no history, no place where she truly belonged. But now she understood the truth. She came from people who loved fiercely, people who protected one another even when the world turned cruel, people who built hidden rooms just to keep tenderness alive. And somehow, that felt stronger than shame. It felt like inheritance. Real inheritance. Not the farmhouse, not the land, but the courage to finally stop hiding. For the first time in years, Eliza didn't leave. That alone felt strange. Her entire adult life had been built around movement, temporary jobs, temporary beds, temporary people. Whenever things became too painful or too complicated, she disappeared before anyone could leave her first. But Blackwater Ridge was different. The orchard no longer felt abandoned to her now. It felt alive. Every creaking floorboard inside the farmhouse, every faded photograph, every letter tied carefully with ribbon upstairs in the shed. It all carried traces of people who had once fought desperately to keep love alive in a world that wanted silence instead. And somehow, that made Eliza want to stay. The next few weeks passed quietly. In the mornings, she cleaned the farmhouse room by room, opening windows that hadn't been touched in years. Dust floated through beams of sunlight, while old floorboards groaned beneath her bare feet. At night, she sat in the hidden room beneath the shed reading journals until candlelight blurred her vision. Some entries were heartbreaking, others beautiful. Samuel wrote poetry in the margins of grocery lists. Miriam documented entire afternoons spent teaching Claire how to bake peach cobbler. Daniel sketched tiny portraits beside unfinished thoughts. And everywhere, there was love. Messy, complicated, human love. The kind history rarely bothered preserving. One evening, Eliza found herself reading aloud from one of Samuel's journals, while Daniel listened quietly from the old leather sofa. There are people who spend their whole lives hiding softness because the world mistakes tenderness for weakness, she read softly. Daniel smiled faintly. That sounds like him. Eliza looked up. Why did nobody know about this place? Daniel leaned back slowly, eyes drifting across the room. Because survival used to depend on silence. His voice turned quieter. Back then, Popple disappeared for less. Eliza nodded slowly. She understood that now. But something inside her resisted the idea that these stories should remain buried forever, especially after realizing how many people probably carried histories just like this one. Hidden, unspoken, forgotten. 3 days later, she drove into town for groceries. Blackwater Ridge looked exactly how she imagined a place trapped in time would look: small diners, weathered churches, old men drinking coffee outside hardware stores while everybody quietly noticed strangers. And people noticed Eliza immediately. At the grocery store, conversations lowered when she walked past. At the gas station, someone whispered, "That's the Holloway girl." The Holloway girl. The words stayed with her all afternoon. Not Brooks. Not homeless, not orphan, not lost. Holloway. For the first time in her life, Eliza belonged to something, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. That night, while sorting old photographs upstairs in the shed, she found a newspaper clipping tucked inside one of Miriam's journals. The headline read, "Local artist found dead after winter illness." Below it was a small black and white photograph of Samuel. The article itself was painfully short, cold, dismissive. No mention of Daniel, no mention of Claire, no mention of the people who loved him enough to build an entire hidden room just to keep him safe. Eliza stared at the article for a long time. Then anger slowly rose inside her chest. Not loud anger, the dangerous kind. The kind born from grief. Because Samuel deserved more than a 3-inch obituary buried beside weather reports. And suddenly Eliza realized something terrifying. How many people like him had disappeared quietly from history? How many stories had been erased simply because they made others uncomfortable? The thought wouldn't leave her alone. The next morning, she drove to the public library. The librarian, a woman named Ruth with silver curls and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, watched Eliza carefully as she approached the desk, carrying a stack of old photographs. "I think these belong to this town," Eliza said softly. Ruth adjusted her glasses. Then her expression changed the moment she saw Samuel's face. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "You knew him." Ruth looked up slowly. Everybody knew of him. She hesitated. But nobody talked openly back then. Eliza nodded. "That's the problem." The older woman stared at her quietly for several seconds before asking, "What exactly are you trying to do here, sweetheart?" Eliza looked down at the photographs in her hands, and for the first time, the answer came easily. "I think," she swallowed softly, "I think I want people to remember them properly." Something in Ruth's expression softened instantly. By the end of the afternoon, Eliza had a list of local historians, archivists, and preservation groups willing to help digitize the journals and letters. Word spread faster than she expected. A week later, people started showing up at the farmhouse. At first only one or two, then more. An elderly woman brought letters written by her sister to another woman during the 1960s. A retired farmer confessed he'd hidden photographs of his partner for over 40 years. One man simply sat inside the shed and cried quietly for nearly an hour before whispering, "We thought nobody would ever understand." Eliza listened to every story, every single one, because she understood something now that she hadn't before. People don't only need food or shelter to survive. Sometimes they need proof that their lives mattered, that they were here, that somebody remembers. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the orchard trees, Daniel stood beside Eliza outside the shed watching lantern light glow softly through the windows. "You've changed this place already," he said quietly. Eliza shook her head. "No." She looked toward the hidden room beneath the shed. "This place changed me." Daniel smiled sadly. Miriam hoped it would. Eliza looked across the orchard where fireflies drifted through the darkening fields like floating stars. For so many years, she believed inheritance meant money, property, land, possessions. But now she understood the truth. Real inheritance was memory. Truth passed carefully from one wounded generation to the next until someone brave enough finally carried it into the light. And standing there beneath the orchard sky, listening to laughter drift softly from the restored shed behind her, Eliza realized something extraordinary. For the first time in her life, she wasn't surviving anymore. She was building something that might outlive all of them. Eliza used to apologize for everything, for asking questions, for taking up space, for existing too loudly in rooms that already seemed tired of her before she even entered them. Years of instability had trained her to become smaller. Smaller voice, smaller needs, smaller dreams. Because when people leave often enough, you start believing your existence is something temporary, something easy to forget. But Blackwater Ridge was changing that. Slowly, quietly, like sunlight creeping across a floor after a long winter. By autumn, the shed no longer belonged only to the past. It had become something alive. Lanterns glowed warmly through the windows almost every evening now. People gathered around the long wooden table beneath the hidden room, drinking coffee, sharing photographs, unfolding letters with trembling hands. Stories filled the space where silence once lived. And somehow, without meaning to, Eliza had become the person holding those stories together. At first, she hated speaking when visitors arrived. Her voice still shook sometimes, especially during the story circles Daniel encouraged her to host every Sunday evening. The first time she stood in front of strangers holding one of Samuel's journals, her hands trembled so badly she almost dropped it. "I'm not good at this," she whispered beforehand. Daniel smiled gently from his chair near the fireplace. Neither was Samuel, he said. That's why people trusted him. That surprised her. Samuel existed in Eliza's mind almost like a myth, now fearless, artistic, emotionally open in ways most people never dared to be. But Daniel only laughed softly. He was terrified half the time. Eliza frowned. Then, how did he do it? Daniel looked toward the orchard outside the window. Because sometimes courage isn't confidence. His eyes softened. Sometimes courage is simply deciding something matters more than fear. Those words stayed with her, especially later that night when she finally stood before 12 strangers inside the shed. Journal clutched tightly against her chest. Her pulse hammered violently, but then she looked around the room. An elderly man holding his husband's photograph beneath the table. A teenage girl twisting nervously beside her mother. A woman quietly crying before the evening had even begun. And suddenly Eliza understood. These people weren't here for perfection. They were here because they were tired of hiding too. So she opened the journal. And read. At first her voice came softly, unsteady. But as Samuel's words filled the room, something shifted. The fear didn't disappear completely. It simply stopped mattering as much. By the end of the reading, nobody spoke for several seconds. Then the teenage girl in the back whispered, "That sounded like my brother." And an older woman quietly replied, "That sounded like me." Eliza felt tears sting her eyes instantly. Because in that moment, she realized stories could do something extraordinary. They could make lonely people feel less alone. After that night, the gatherings grew larger. People traveled from neighboring towns, then neighboring counties. Some arrived carrying boxes of forgotten letters. Others brought journals hidden for decades in attic crawlspaces. Some brought nothing except memories they'd never spoken aloud before. And Eliza listened to every one of them, carefully, like each story was fragile enough to break if handled too quickly. One afternoon, while interviewing an elderly woman named Margaret for the archive project, Eliza asked gently, "Why didn't you ever tell anyone before?" Margaret stared out toward the orchard for a long moment before answering. "Because after a while," she whispered, "you stop believing the world wants your truth." The sentence hit Eliza hard, because she understood it completely. For most of her life, she'd hidden pieces of herself, too. The hunger, the loneliness, the shame of sleeping in parking lots while pretending everything was fine. But now people looked at her differently. Not with pity, with trust. And that terrified her almost as much as it healed her. One evening, after a gathering ended, Eliza remained alone inside the hidden room beneath the shed. Candles flickered softly against the stone walls while old jazz music played quietly from Samuel's restored record player. She stood staring at the portrait of her mother again. Claire Holloway. For years, Eliza had carried silent resentment toward her, for leaving, for hiding the truth, for dying before explaining anything. But now she understood something she hadn't before. Her mother hadn't been weak. She'd simply been wounded in ways Eliza was only beginning to comprehend. Entire generations of people had learned to survive by burying themselves. And survival leaves scars. Eliza stepped closer to the painting slowly. "I get it now," she whispered softly. The words cracked something open inside her. Not anger, not grief. Forgiveness. Real forgiveness. For her mother. For herself. For all the years they spent drowning quietly in inherited silence. Footsteps creaked above her suddenly. Then Daniel appeared at the bottom of the stairs carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You missed dinner again," he said gently. Eliza laughed softly through tears and accepted the mug. "You sound like family when you say that." Daniel looked at her carefully for a long moment. Then he smiled. "Maybe that's because you are." The words hit harder than she expected. Family. Not temporary, not borrowed, not conditional. Real. For so many years, Eliza believed home was a place people were lucky enough to keep. But standing there beneath the warm lantern light, surrounded by stories rescued from silence, she realized home could also be something rebuilt, piece by piece, truth by truth, person by person. Outside, autumn wind moved gently through the orchard trees, while lantern light spilled softly from the shed windows into the darkness beyond. And for the first time since she was a little girl, Eliza no longer felt like someone waiting to be abandoned. She felt like someone who had finally learned how to stay. By the following summer, people no longer called it the Holloway Farm. They called it the room between. The name appeared quietly at first, in newspaper articles, on handwritten postcards, in conversations between strangers who arrived carrying pieces of themselves they had hidden for years. Eliza never intended for any of it to become famous. That was never the point. The point was simpler than that. To make sure people who had once been forced into silence were finally heard. And somehow, that small hidden room beneath the shed had grown into something far bigger than any of them imagined. Cars lined the gravel road nearly every weekend now. Visitors came from neighboring states carrying journals, photographs, cassette tapes, love letters folded so many times the paper had nearly become cloth. Some stayed for hours, some only for minutes, but almost all of them cried before they left. Not because the place was sad, because it made them feel seen. One warm August evening, Eliza stood alone in the orchard watching lanterns glow softly inside the shed while voices drifted through the open windows. Laughter, music, life. The trees swayed gently beneath the golden sunset, branches heavy with fruit for the first time in years. Daniel stepped beside her quietly, hands tucked into the pockets of his old cardigan. "You know," he said softly, "Miriam always believed this land remembered people." Eliza smiled faintly. "What does that mean?" Daniel looked toward the orchard. "She used to say grief sinks into places." He paused. "But so does love." Eliza stared at the rows of trees stretching endlessly beneath the fading light. For so long, she thought loneliness was something permanent, something stitched permanently into her bones. But now she understood something different. Loneliness can survive in silence, but it struggles in places where truth is spoken aloud. That realization changed everything. A few weeks later, the town hosted its first public remembrance gathering at the orchard. Nobody expected many people to come. Nearly 200 arrived. Foldable chairs filled the fields beneath hanging lanterns while families spread blankets across the grass. Teenagers interviewed elders for the archive project. Musicians played softly near the porch while people read letters aloud into the warm evening air. And at the center of it all stood the old shed, no longer hidden, no longer ashamed. Open. Eliza nearly cried the moment she saw a line forming outside the doorway. People waiting patiently not to enter a museum, but to enter a story. Daniel sat near the front beneath the magnolia tree planted earlier that spring, his eyes shining quietly as visitors approached him one after another to shake his hand. "Thank you for staying," one woman whispered to him tearfully. Daniel simply smiled. Later that evening, Ruth from the library stepped onto the small wooden stage near the orchard and tapped gently against the microphone. "I think," she said warmly, "there's someone we should hear from tonight." Eliza froze instantly. The crowd turned toward her. "Oh no," she whispered under her breath. Daniel chuckled softly beside her. "Too late now." Her stomach twisted with panic as people began clapping gently, encouragingly. A year ago, she would have run, without hesitation, but something inside her had changed. So instead, Eliza slowly walked toward the stage beneath the lantern light. The applause faded into silence as she stepped up to the microphone. For one terrifying second, she forgot how to breathe. Then she looked out across the orchard, at the elderly couples holding hands, at teenagers sitting cross-legged in the grass, at strangers wiping tears from their cheeks beside people they'd met only hours earlier. And suddenly, she realized none of them expected perfection, only honesty. Eliza swallowed hard. Then she spoke. "When I arrived here," she began softly, "I thought I inherited an abandoned farm." A few quiet laughs moved through the crowd. But what I really inherited, her voice trembled slightly, was proof that people can survive extraordinary pain and still choose love. Silence settled across the orchard. Warm, listening. For most of my life, I believed my family history was empty. She glanced toward the shed. I thought silence meant there was nothing worth remembering. Her eyes filled with tears. But silence doesn't always mean absence. She smiled faintly. Sometimes it means people were protecting pieces of themselves the world refused to protect for them. Several people wiped quietly at their eyes now. Eliza continued. "This place taught me something I wish more people understood." She paused. That nobody should have to hide in order to deserve love. The orchard fell completely still. Even the wind seemed to stop. And somewhere, deep in the crowd, someone began crying softly. Eliza looked toward the hidden shed one last time. Toward the room that changed her life. Toward the stories buried there for decades, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to uncover them. Then she smiled through tears. "And maybe," she whispered, "the bravest thing any of us can do is let ourselves be fully seen." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the crowd rose slowly to its feet. Not loud, not dramatic, just hundreds of people standing together beneath the orchard sky, applauding not only for Eliza, but for every person who never got the chance to tell their truth out loud. Later that night, long after the gathering ended, Eliza sat alone beneath the magnolia tree beside the shed. The orchard glowed silver beneath the moonlight. Inside the hidden room, lanterns still flickered softly against stone walls lined with rescued histories. She thought about the frightened girl who once slept in her car believing she belonged nowhere. That girl felt impossibly far away now, because for the first time in her life, Eliza finally understood something extraordinary. She had not been abandoned by the world. She had simply been searching for the place where her story could finally begin. And somehow, it had been waiting for her all along. When Eliza Brooks arrived at the old farm, she thought she inherited nothing more than a forgotten house and a broken past. But inside the hidden shed, she discovered something far more powerful. A family that loved deeply, people who hid their truth just to survive, and a history waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. For most of her life, Eliza believed she was alone, but the orchard taught her that silence does not mean love was never there. Sometimes people hide because the world made honesty dangerous, and sometimes healing begins the moment someone finally tells the truth. By opening one forgotten door, Eliza gave hidden stories a voice and finally found a place where she belonged. Many people carry pain, secrets, or family histories they were never allowed to talk about. This story reminds us that compassion can heal what silence once buried, because everyone deserves to be remembered honestly, not just politely. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes every hidden story deserves to be heard.